Hello, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to welcome Marilyn today for our September event in our Scholars Library series. I'm sure other people are going to trickle in as we go, and feel free to keep your video on or turn it off if you'd rather. But thank you for coming. I know a lot of you have been here before, but each month this initiative allows an alum to come and talk about their literary works to those within the community and beyond it as well. And today we're really excited to welcome Marilyn, who's going to talk about her book, Getting to Good Friday and the Peace Process in Northern Ireland. And in a change of the usual format, we've got our very own online community manager, Richard, who you may know from interactions about everything Rose Connect. And he's here to moderate the conversation today, and I'm sure he'll explain a bit more about why he volunteered for the opportunity. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard, and he'll give you a further introduction to Marilyn and the session, and we can get into it. If you have any questions, please do have a think and put them in the chat as we go, and we can fit them into the audience Q&A section at the end. But over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Georgie. So let me start by introducing Marilyn. Marilyn earned her undergraduate degree in American History and Literature from Harvard, and then came to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar in 1988 to study English. She's currently a professor of English at Georgia State University in Atlanta, where she teaches British, Irish, and world literature. And she spent the first half of 2017 researching and teaching at Queen's University in Belfast as a US Fulbright scholar. And so what we're going to talk about today is, and I've got a copy here, Getting to Good Friday. Marilyn very kindly donated 2 copies of this book to the library at Rhodes House. And obviously, I've got one of them here at the moment. But yeah, I'll put it back, I promise. And so you can go and take a look at that. But I think, Marilyn, along the way, we're also going to talk about 2 of the earlier books as well, before Getting to Good Friday. Acting Between the Lines, about the Field Day Theatre Company, and your biography of Stuart Parker, both of which I think are part of your journey towards Good Friday. So I think we ought to start with a bit of context about this. I mean, Getting to Good Friday is a book about the history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland towards the peace process and the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in April 1998, intertwined with looking at how literature from that time responds and reacts and covers that period of history. And one of the things that really struck me in the introduction to the book, Marilyn, is you said that when you were in Belfast in 2017, you found that you were lecturing young British and Irish students, and finding that you knew more about that period of history than they did, because Northern Ireland has been relatively peaceful for 25 years. And to Georgie's point earlier, that's very much why I wanted to volunteer to do this. I mean, it's a period of time I lived through, but anyone under the age of 25 will have never experienced any of that. So I wonder, I mean, could we start perhaps with just a little bit of the history about, explain the divisions in Northern Ireland and what the period that euphemistically, in classic sort of Irish understatement, is referred to as the Troubles?
Yes, that's a big question. On the most basic level, the division in Northern Ireland is what we call an ethno-national one. People with different cultural backgrounds that tend to align with different political positions. So broadly speaking, a unionist is someone who believes that Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom, a unionist. You know, United Kingdom is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. A nationalist is someone who tends to think of the island of Ireland as a natural, obviously geographic unit, but also a natural political unit, and would favor some kind of all Ireland political arrangement. You know, practically speaking, nowadays, probably that would mean what's now Northern Ireland coming under the jurisdiction of the Irish state, the Republic of Ireland. So the Troubles. Historically, most unionists in Northern Ireland are Protestants, and most nationalists are Catholic, although there are Protestant nationalists and Catholic Unionists, but broadly speaking, those have tended to align. And the history of Ireland and Britain is a very long and complicated one. To even start to talk about it, you practically have to go back to the Tudor period of English history, when Ireland was the first colony of England. And it was a colony of England for hundreds of years, until 1800, when the Act of Union was passed that made Ireland part of the British state, part of the United Kingdom. And that was the case for 120 years or so. But meanwhile, in Ireland, a cultural and political nationalist movement was growing. Growing calls for Ireland to have some kind, at least, of home rule, self-determination. And after World War I, there was actually an Anglo-Irish war in Ireland that ended with terms. The British government agreed to create an independent Irish state, but at the same time, it partitioned Ireland to appease a hard core of Unionists in the northeast part, which was the most Protestant part of Ireland, people so opposed to home rule that actually were determined to oppose it by force. As Stuart Parker said, here were these people ready to fight the British government to defend their right to remain British. So basically, that's what happened. There were two states on the island of Ireland, the Irish Free State and Northern Ireland. So the problem is essentially a problem of two minorities. There was the historical minority of Northern Catholics in Northern Ireland, but there was also the minority of Protestants in the island of Ireland as a whole, which was why those Unionists were so antsy about the idea of being part of a unitary Irish state. And so insecure was the new Unionist government that even though Northern Ireland was really engineered, or they thought at the time that it might have a permanent Protestant majority, they made no effort to make Northern Ireland a place where Northern Catholics would actually want to be. So there was all kinds of official and unofficial discrimination against Catholics, a very sectarian police force, a lot of discrimination in employment, because most of the big employers were Protestants and Unionist, gerrymandering to create artificial Unionist majorities, even in places like the city of Derry, which was a majority Catholic city. Discrimination in the allocation of public housing, which was a big issue in Northern Ireland, a very working class part of the United Kingdom. And, votes were tied to property ownership, which again was predominantly Unionist. So there was all kinds of official and unofficial discrimination. And that began to be challenged by the Catholics in the late 1960s. The Education Act, passed by the Westminster government and extended to Northern Ireland, allowed for the education of working class people who normally, or before that, wouldn't have gotten an education. And in Northern Ireland, the effect disproportionately benefited Catholics because they had been more poorer before. So finally, you had this educated Catholic middle class that started challenging some of this discrimination. And in 1967, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was found, modeled explicitly on the civil rights movement in the United States. And they started agitating, appealing over the head of the Unionist government in Northern Ireland to the British government in Westminster, just as African-American civil rights campaigners had appealed over the heads of the states to the federal government to say, you have the ultimate authority here, you need to do something about this. So that was their strategy. But unfortunately, there was a very reactionary response to this from the Unionist government. Things got worse, really, instead of better. And before long, the old Republican demands, and Republican is kind of a more extreme form of nationalism, wanting complete separation from the British government, started to gain traction. And then you had this escalating cycle of violence from 1968 or 1969 till the point the British troops were sent in to attempt to keep the peace in August 1969. And what followed was really 30 years of political and sectarian violence.
So I mean, that's what, hundreds of years of history in less than 10 minutes, which I think is a remarkably efficient way of doing it. I'm sure that when it was explained to me in a pub when I was about 20, it must have taken us about 2 hours to cover that. So, well, fantastic explanation. I know that you've recommended, we could easily spend the whole hour just purely on the history, but you've suggested a documentary series that was on BBC earlier this year, and I think also shown on PBS in the US, and I think it's available on both.
PBS, you can view it, you can stream it online on the PBS website or on the app. So,
I mean, I think that's a series of about 5 75-minute episodes describing the history, and with sort of interspersed with contemporary news reports. So rather than spend a whole hour on that, it's a great place to go and find out a little bit more about it. I mean, it's really striking, I think, in the book that you start with a list of acronyms that, you know, the IRA and the UDF and the UVF, and it's a whole vocabulary that you need really to understand the detail of it. And one of the things the book does, of course, is go through this in some very explicit detail about who all these people are, and it just leaves me immediately thinking, so what was it that got a 1988 scholar from Kansas interested in, you know, what increasingly looks like a fairly obscure bit of British history? What attracted you to that?
Well, of course, it wasn't obscure at the time.
Well, no, of course, yeah.
But you know, I wasn't explicitly drawn by that. As an undergraduate at Harvard, I was an American history and literature major. So I was interested always in the intersections of history and literature. And I was fortunate as an undergraduate to take a class in British and Irish poetry from Seamus Heaney, who was then teaching. He was a professor at Harvard. He had spent half the year at Harvard and half the year in Dublin. And I also was active in student theater productions. I acted in a play by Brian Friel called Philadelphia, Here I Come. So I'd had those sorts of introductions to Northern Irish literature without focusing on it in any sort of scholarly way. But in 1989, the summer of 1989, I traveled to Ireland for the first time. I met a friend there, Bob Lamb, who was obsessed with Irish literature, and he planned this very literary tour of Ireland. And we visited sites in Dublin and Galway and Sligo and the Aran Islands that were associated with Irish writers. And I basically fell in love with the place. And I decided that, you know, I was just at that point, and I'd finished the first year of an MPhil, and I was at the point where I had to decide what to write my MPhil thesis on. And I was considering everything from ghost stories to Edwardian literature. I mean, nothing at all remotely like this. But I thought, well, if I do my thesis on an Irish topic, I'll have an excuse to come back. And so that's what I did.
But you told me you didn't actually go to Belfast or to Northern Ireland in that first visit, did you?
No, I didn't visit Northern Ireland on that first visit, and very, very few tourists in 1989 would have dreamed of crossing that border north. The troubles were very much ongoing. And unbeknownst to me, again, at the time, 1988 had been a particularly violent year with lots of high-profile incidents that I was blissfully unaware of at the time.
So what took you to Belfast for the first time?
Well, it was the topic I ended up researching. Well, on that first trip to Ireland, I heard about the Field Day Theatre Company. And it caught my attention because I was interested in theatre. It was a theatre company based in Derry, Northern Ireland, so based in that Catholic majority city on the western edge of Northern Ireland. And it toured north and south of the border. It toured throughout Ireland, which was actually unique at the time. And it happened to involve a couple of people I was familiar with. Seamus Heaney was on the board of directors. Brian Friel was on the board of directors. He had founded the company with Stephen Ray. And so it caught my attention, and I saw references to it here and there, and I started asking everybody I met, well, what about this Field Day Theatre Company? And every person I asked who had heard of it, at least, gave me a different answer. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. There's something here worth exploring. So I went back to Oxford and I said, I want to write my MPhil thesis on the Field Day Theatre Company. And basically nobody said no.
So we will come on and talk about Field Day in a moment. I mean, but tell me what your impressions of visiting Northern Ireland for the first time were. I mean, I first went in 95, I think. So, which was during one of the ceasefires, so it was a relatively calm time. I mean, you were there in a much more violent period at the time.
Well, I should say right off the bat that I have never witnessed personally any violent incident in Northern Ireland. I think once I saw some people chasing some other people at an interface area, and that's as far as I have come personally. But the troubles were ongoing. I took some comfort in the fact that neither side was interested in killing tourists. That would have been terrible PR, and they both had strong ties to the US, and so especially Americans were kind of, generally speaking, off limits. Probably I wasn't as nervous as I should have been. I did notice things, there were no left luggage facilities. You mentioned something like that in your blog on the subject. What you noticed immediately was how run down the place was. Very run down. The IRA had been conducting a war against economic targets for years, with lots of firebombing of shops and factories and the like, with the goal of making Northern Ireland ungovernable, basically. So there were a lot of empty shop fronts, not many places to shop or eat or stay, not much in the way of tourist facility, because there were hardly any tourists. Hardly anybody from outside the place was visiting, apart from journalists. And the downtown hotel where they stayed had the dubious distinction of being one of the most bombed buildings in
the Europa, isn't it? The Europa Hotel.
It was
it was the most.
There were lots of boarded up buildings and a visible military presence. I was staying in dormitories at Queen's University, so in a relatively salubrious part of town, but right across the street from this student village, there was an army post, and you could see, cameras up, surveillance cameras up, and occasional, the tanks going by, or Land Rovers, I guess. The military presence was even much more present in Derry, where I did a lot of my research, because it's a much smaller city. So you could see what was happening much more clearly. And the whole city was, it was a Republican, it still is, I suppose, a Republican stronghold. So the whole place was, the whole, at least the side of the city where I would stay, which was on that side of the river, you could see soldiers patrolling in 2s and 3s just all the time. When I walked to the Field Day offices to do a lot of my archival research, I passed armed guards. There was lots of barbed wire. I mean, it was very visible that something was not normal here.
A slight diverse. First time I went to Belfast, for some reason, and I forget why, I was wearing a red denim jacket, which was not a good way to look unobtrusive. And I walked up the Falls Road and down the Shankill Road, which was the two sort of the unionist and nationalist sort of strongholds, which are actually right next to each other, a massive wall in between, thinking, really thinking, don't anyone speak to me because I'll have to answer in a very English accent. And it felt, even during a ceasefire, it felt very uncomfortable at that time. So anyway, Field Day. I mean, that's, you mentioned the Field Day theatre company. Tell us about that, because that's what you wrote. The first book was you wrote about that. Tell us about Field Day.
The Field Day Theatre Company was it was a politically motivated theater group. As I said, it toured on both sides of the border, which in itself was making a kind of implicit political statement that it regarded the whole of the island as its territory, so to speak. It had a very once a year, generally an average of once a year, it would produce a new play by an Irish author. And this got a lot of attention. You know, I think it showed something good, something enviable happening in Northern Ireland, which was a great rarity in the 1980s. Celebrities from both sides of the border, from England, would come over and to those first nights, Derry first nights. The plays would be done in the Guildhall in Derry, because Derry didn't even have a dedicated theater building at the time. You know, it was a very deprived city. So that was one part of what they did. But they also had an active publishing wing. So they put out series of pamphlets that came from a broadly speaking nationalist / Republican point of view. They were instrumental in kind of starting to apply post-colonial theory to Ireland, and in viewing Northern Ireland as a kind of remnant of that post-colonial struggle. So, you know, they were coming from a certain perspective and viewed with suspicion by unionists as a result. So I was trying really to be as objective as I could. You know, I set out to write a history of the company's first 5 years. And I wasn't trying to make an argument about it. I was simply trying to say what they did and how that was received, what their actions and the reactions they provoked. Leveraging, I suppose, the one thing I had going for me as a researcher really is that I was not biased. I have no British or Irish heritage, at least that I'm aware of, which must make me an oddity really in the United States. And so I had no inherited opinions about the subject, which is another way of saying I was completely ignorant of it. I was trying to leverage that as best I could. I can't.
Oh, no, I was on mute. Sorry, my fault. What you did after that was quite an attempt to kind of rebalance that, having with Field Day seen as a nationalist thing. You started looking at it from a unionist side as well.
Yeah, my second book project does complement the first one nicely, because it centers on a Protestant writer from a unionist background, although, you know, he was certainly not a hardline unionist by any stretch of the imagination. But Stuart Parker, Field Day had produced one of his plays in 1987, Pentecost, his last stage play. And I had read it as I was doing the research for that. And I started reading his other work. And I was just so attracted to his work. I loved his work. But there was very little written about him. A lot of the work itself wasn't available. You know, I could read what was out there, but a lot of it wasn't even published. I wanted to know more. And the only way to learn it was to write that book myself. And I spent 20 years on that project. So immersed in, and definitely getting a much clearer sense of the Protestant unionist side of the equation. And he was from Belfast and obsessed with Belfast. So that too kind of balanced the Derry focus of the Field Day book.
Okay, so as we knew it would, it's taken us almost half an hour to actually get to the book we're meant to be talking about. But I think it's such essential sort of background to it, and of course what the Getting to Good Friday book is doing is describing the history of how to get there, but then intertwined with the literature. And when I read the book, and the passage that really jumped out most to me was the one you included from the Deirdre Madden book, One by One in the Darkness. And I wondered, do you want to read a small section of that, because I think it just portrays what was going on in such very human terms.
I think one thing literature can do is to offer a kind of emotional history of the Troubles. You know, how did they feel to people living through them? And I think, you know, the idea that people were fighting in the streets is not what it's not what it was like. But there was a lot of violence, and you knew that anything could happen anywhere at any time. It could happen and did sometimes, but in practice, most of the violence occurred in certain working class areas. But even in those places, as Anna Burns demonstrates brilliantly in her 2018 novel, Milkman, even in those places, people were able to remember and forget that this was happening at the same time. You know, we might wonder how people managed to just live their lives. You know, they kind of adapted to it, worked around it, carried on. And in that connection, I would say, you know, there's an awful lot of violence in the United States. And one of the things that surprised me the most, the first time I visited Belfast, I arrived at my lodgings, it was late, 11:30 at night, but I hadn't had a chance to eat. And I asked someone there, you know, where can I get something to eat? And he was like, oh yeah, you know, just walk up that road, you know, half a mile or whatever. And I was like, really? At 11:30? I would not have dreamed of roaming around by myself as a single woman in any major city in the United States. That was something it was perfectly safe to do in that part of Belfast at that time.
It notoriously had one of the lowest normal crime rates in the whole of Britain at the time, which seemed totally at odds with what you knew about the place. But it's true, absolutely true.
Yes, and you know, I would say too, you know, we take a lot of violence for granted here, and just this year in the United States, in 2023, as of 3 days ago, there had been 501 mass shootings in which 4 or more people were injured or killed. In 2021, 690 people were killed in the United States in mass shootings. You know, in one incident in Las Vegas in 2017, more than 50 people were killed and over 500 wounded. No single incident in the Troubles comes close to that. In 30 years, 3,720 people were killed over 30 years. But of course, Northern Ireland is the size of Connecticut. So everybody knew somebody who was affected more or less directly in one way or another. So this little passage I want to read is about Deirdre Madden's novel, One by One in the Darkness. The knowledge of how quickly and arbitrarily lives could be ended or blighted lurked in the minds of all Northern Irish people during the Troubles. Madden makes this point with striking directness through a young school teacher's unwilling recollection of a strange incident that occurred about 7 months before. She had been with her pupils in her classroom when a van stopped at the school gates, and a man she did not recognize ran towards the school. Something closed in her heart, and convinced that the school was about to be attacked, she ordered the children to put their heads on their arms and close their eyes. She knew this to be a wholly inadequate response, but even in retrospect, could not imagine what she should have done instead. She had waited tensely for the man to burst in and start shooting, but nothing happened. And then she had noticed him outside again, running away from the school and towards his van through the steady rain. The rain. When the children left at the end of the day, she had put her head on her folded arms and wept uncontrollably. Madden writes, she cried because she might not have been wrong. Over the past 20-odd years, all kinds of people had been killed or maimed. Many of them might have thought that the tasks in which they were engaged would have nullified their risk of danger, but they would have been wrong. Bricklayers and binmen on their tea break had been shot. They'd killed a man driving a school bus full of children, opened fire on supporters at a football match, and shot people sitting in a bookies watching horse racing on television. Men lying in bed asleep beside their wives or girlfriends had been woken up and murdered. At each new variation, Sally had shared in the shock of those around her. To kill the members of a show band. How could anyone go into a church and start shooting at the congregation? And yet each event seemed to be no preparation, no warning for the next. Until someone attacked mourners at a funeral and threw hand grenades at them, it seemed impossible that this should ever happen. So no one had ever gone into a primary school in Northern Ireland and opened fire on a gaggle of 5-year-olds and their female teacher. What did that prove? Nothing, Sally thought. Just because a thing hasn't happened doesn't mean that it never will. And
I just have shivers go down my spine for that. I find it such a moving section. So kind of the randomness of apparent randomness of the violence. And it was a bit that I kept going back to in the book. And it, of the books that you cover, it is the one that deals sort of most directly, most head on, I think. I wonder, I'm just going to invite other people to perhaps start posting questions and things, but while people are doing that, ask you how you went about selecting the books there, because some of them cover it much more tangentially, don't they? I mean, the Bernard Laverty one about someone who leaves Northern Ireland and goes to live somewhere else as a composer and the impact that. What made it, because you haven't picked very many books that really are about violence. They're more about the human condition, aren't they?
Or that aren't about Northern Ireland directly.
Yeah.
So many of them. I think what I was trying to do was to write a history of the peace process that would make the steps that led toward the settlement more intelligible to people who might know nothing about it starting out. You know, I had spent 20-odd years thinking about Northern Ireland at war. And I wanted to write about Northern Ireland at peace. I wanted to get to know Northern Ireland at peace. And this was 2015. I was writing a Fulbright application to spend a year in Belfast. And this was my grand plan. You know, just wanted to get to know what Northern Ireland was like in this post-conflict period. Well, I got the Fulbright and I got to Belfast. And within a month, the local arrangements, the government fell apart. The Sinn Féin withdrew from the government, the institutions were suspended. It would be 3 years before they were reinstated. All of a sudden, the peace looked a lot shakier than it had, more or less directly because of Brexit. We can talk more about that later if you'd like, but
we may not have time to do that fully,
Brexit
though.
gave the project a lot more urgency. So I wanted to show how the peace had come about. It had been so kind of carelessly risked in this. I wanted people to understand the shifts in thinking and talking about the problem that made the peace possible. So I wanted to align the text with specific incidents during the peace process. And one of the most direct examples of that I can give is a Michael Longley poem called Ceasefire, that was published in the Irish Times just 3 days after the IRA ceasefire of August 1994, which was a key moment in the peace process. It showed that, you know, militant Republicans were ready, wanted to negotiate, wanted some kind of peace. So a major, major incident. And Longley actually started writing this poem before the ceasefire was declared. He wrote it to try to influence the IRA leadership, which was debating they were debating among themselves whether or not to do this. And he wanted to make his little intervention, push them in that direction. And so oddly enough, he decided to write about an incident from the Iliad. Homer's epic about another long war. And this is an episode at the very end of the Iliad where King Priam, the Trojan king, goes to see the Greek warrior Achilles to request the body of his son. Achilles had killed his son after his son had killed Achilles' best friend, and he was mutilating the body and trying to destroy it. And the king wanted his son's body back. So the god sends him there. He goes to see him, and he gets what he came for. And here is the poem. And it's important to know that this episode comes midway through the Trojan War. The Iliad ends with this episode, but that's actually not the end of the Trojan War. It's going to go on after that, and Achilles will get killed too. But this is a moment in the middle of the fighting. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears, Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed, and for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they had eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still, and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son. When Priam suddenly appears in his shelter, Achilles is jolted into an awareness of the old king as a fellow human being. What happens after that derives from the simple fact of their being together in the same room. In the summer of 1994, the fervently hoped-for halt to IRA operations was regarded both as desirable for its own sake and as a necessary prelude to face-to-face negotiations involving Sinn Féin and Northern Ireland's other political parties. So Longley's focus on the potential benefits of personal proximity was calculated to appeal to the poem's primary intended audience, that is, the IRA leadership. So there's just one example of how the literature and the history intertwine.
Thank you. I read the poem for the first time this morning, actually, and beautiful. We have a question from the audience, and that's what I love about this series. It's from Mark Abley, who was on here as the author just a couple of months ago, I think. So to what extent, if at all, did writers in Northern Ireland in the 70s, 80s and 90s see themselves as part of a community that transcended politics? I know that Field Day did fantastic work, but as you said, it worked basically from a nationalist standpoint. Were there groups, formal or informal, that brought writers together above and beyond politics?
Most of the best writers in Northern Ireland resisted the idea of being a mouthpiece for a particular side. Field Day, the Field Day people themselves strongly resisted that. They were really trying to push people on both sides, find some kind of middle ground. The fact that they were pigeonholed the way they do says as much about how polarized the whole society was at that time. It really says as much about that as it says about what they were doing, because really they were consciously trying to challenge nationalist preconceptions too. So most serious writers, I don't know that they'd say they transcended, they might aspire, I guess, to transcend. They didn't want to be just a spokespeople for a particular side, and they resisted the idea that they should do or say anything. There's a kind of a tension there. On the one hand, they would have hotly denied that they were obliged somehow to deal with this material, but on the other hand, most of them did feel compelled to deal with it in one way or another, which was felt by many of them as a burden. There's a wonderful novel by David Park called The Truth Commissioner, published in 2008. It's the single best piece of writing I can recommend about post-conflict Northern Ireland. And it ends with a fire that burns the storage facility of the fictional Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is the focus of the novel. And David Park told me that, he wrote that fire scene, and that was his resolution never to write about the Troubles again, because it had been such an unwelcome burden on him for so long.
So, I mean, that's a terrific thing, because I wanted to ask you about reconciliation, sort of the aftermath, as it were, and the David Park book does that, but through a fictional Truth and Reconciliation Committee, because there wasn't a real one. And to what extent do you think literature's filling the gap for that, or to what extent does the kind of spectre of it still loom over it, because there is so much kind of unresolved tension? I mean, there were when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, there were released prisoners in there who had murdered people, and they were being celebrated as part of this. I mean, that a lot of people find that very difficult. Do you think literature has filled a gap there?
I mean, many of the wounds are still very raw. I mean, this is a whole society, in a sense, suffering kind of post-traumatic stress. One sign of that is the very high suicide rate in Northern Ireland. One shocking statistic: more people in Northern Ireland have killed themselves since the end of the Troubles, since 1998, than died during the Troubles. And a lot of the people who have committed suicide were young people who barely remembered the Troubles, or didn't remember the Troubles. So, there's definite damage there. But I think, if you read that novel by David Park, you probably are not going to come away from it thinking, oh yes, Northern Ireland should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because he shows, all the ways that people would attempt to manipulate the process, that it wouldn't necessarily alleviate the pain. But my argument about his book is that it's really, a novel can be maybe a more effective way of reaching some kinds of truth than a formal process like that could be. Because in reading, you're able to enter into the minds and perspectives of people completely different from yourself, and come away maybe with more understanding of what motivated them. Maybe not to the point of forgiving, but at least understanding.
So conscious of the time, we're a quarter of an hour left. If anyone's got other questions, I mean, please do post them in the chat, put your hand up or something, because otherwise I'm just going to fill the time with stuff I've got to ask Marilyn. So please jump in. I want to ask you about Grace Notes, which is, I mean, the Deirdre Madden book is one I was being very much inspired to read based on reading your book. And Grace Notes has been the other one, which is partly from a love of the Scottish Islands and the fact my son's a composer as well. I could see the parallels, but tell us about that, because that deals sort of much more tangentially with the Troubles.
Yes, and actually this was the work in large part that inspired me to embark on the Getting to Good Friday project. Grace Notes is a novel about a young Northern Irish composer who comes from a Catholic and nationalist background, like Bernard McLaverty himself. Like Bernard McLaverty, she has left Northern Ireland. She lives in Scotland now. She spent time on the island of Islay, where Bernard McLaverty had also taught. Now she lives in Glasgow, where Bernard McLaverty lives. So there are a lot of autobiographical elements to the novel, although she's a woman and he's a man. And a lot of the novel is about the difficulties, the challenges faced by a woman in a very male-dominated field. but also about the challenges faced by a young Northern Catholic in Northern Ireland. So on the face of it, this novel has very little to do with what was going on in Northern Ireland, except that the composer writes music that incorporates lambeg drums, which are an instrument very, very much associated with Protestant Unionist fundamentalism in Northern Ireland. She works those into her symphonic work in a way that kind of illustrates the integration of different sides in Northern Ireland. So there's that kind of overt political level. And when I agreed to write an essay about this novel, 2012, 2013, whenever it was, that's what I intended to write about. But I was surprised to find that that had been thoroughly gone over by the critics. So I needed to find something else to say about it. And I started looking more closely at what was happening in Northern Ireland while Bernard McLaverty was writing the novel. And what was happening, these were the years right after that ceasefire that was such a promising development, but was followed by 2 years and more of nothing much at all happening politically, nobody being willing to kind of give it the other side the benefit of the doubt, to the point, let's start having some negotiations. And so the upshot of that was that the ceasefire ended and the IRA resumed its campaign in the spring of 1997. And all this time, McLaverty was working on his novel. He had begun it right after the ceasefire in this spirit of hope and optimism, and then nothing was happening. And that is encoded, I argue, in the novel, in the composer's attempts to kind of find some common ground again with her mother, from whom she's been estranged. So, that idea of difficult conversations, we need to sit down, we need to have some difficult conversations. Those personal relationships are a metaphor for what was going on politically.
Thank you. A couple more questions coming while we've been talking there. So in your work, you've discussed the ways in which the Good Friday Agreement was written to be read in the nuanced, somewhat ambiguous way that literature is interpreted. Could you expand on that a bit and the impact of that nuance?
Well, as Michael Longley said, in its language, it's like poetic language, because it had to be a document that both sides could see enough of what they wanted in to sign on to. And finding that balance, finding that match, that really was the challenge of the peace process, giving each side enough of what they wanted that they could agree to try to make it work, getting away from old meanings of things. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, would talk a lot about Irish self-determination. So one of the big projects of the constitutional nationalist leaders, the people who wanted to see a united Ireland, but not through violence, was to get them to revise their understanding of that. So instead of Irish self-determination, you had self-determination for all the people of Ireland, which of course includes those unionist people in the northeast corner of Ireland. They're part of the people of Ireland too, and they also participate in this self-determination.
So, and of course, one of the, I'm maybe going to give you a time budget of 90 seconds to talk about Brexit, because otherwise we won't get to Mark's next question. In a way, that's what Brexit has destroyed, some of that ambiguity and nuance, hasn't it? Because where you could be as Irish or as British as you wanted, now the border is a more real thing. I mean, what's been the impact of Brexit? But you only can talk about it for 90 seconds.
Okay. Yes, I mean, the agreement was possible because the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland were both members of the European Union. And the European Union was moving toward greater integration among all the member states. That made the whole idea of national borders a little passé. That border didn't have to matter. And for years, it hasn't mattered, but with Brexit, suddenly that border became the border between the the EU and the rest of the world. It became incredibly important again. So whereas the agreement had allowed you to finesse the question of nationality, yeah, you can be Irish, you can be British, you can be both, you can have the citizenship you choose, all of a sudden it became very important again. That border, which people had been starting to forget about, became a major focus again. And that's so destructive.
Having just read Audrey McGee's wonderful novel, The Colony, 2022, but set in the Troubles, I'm curious as to whether you see any significant differences in how male and female writers have addressed the period.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be comfortable generalizing about that. I guess I would say that perhaps the male authors are a little more inclined to think in overtly political terms. I would say the male writers I look at are more maybe actively trying to influence public events than many of the female writers would be, but that's a big generalization. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to do a lot more research before I could answer that.
So I wonder, maybe we finish with thinking about the relevance of this now. I mean, because this is not over really, is it? I mean, we talked about the impact of Brexit. It was only, I think, last month that the Chief Constable of the Police Service in Northern Ireland was forced to resign over a data breach that was thought to endanger the lives of Catholic police officers. This is still sort of very real. And what do you think the literature can do to kind of warn us about sliding back into what happened before?
Well, I mean, I think the literature is very important in conveying, some literature is very important in conveying what life was like at that time. I'd mention again Anna Burns's novel Milkman, which paints such a vivid picture of just life at that time when things were so completely divided, and the narrator is living within just this totalitarian, really, state. I mean, well, within a totalitarian Republican area within kind of a totalitarian, it's not something anyone should want to go back to. But it's a bit of a dangerous time when young people have no recollection of that, no memory of that. So it's valuable in that sense. And as I argue in my book, some of the works that I look at valuable in helping people understand how painstakingly that piece was made, how long it took to make, how carefully people had to tease these things out to get to even the beginnings of an agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement really is the beginning of another longer, more challenging process of social reconciliation that needs to be, ongoing. So my hope is that it can help people appreciate the achievement, but also what still remains to be done.
Did you find from when you were teaching there in 2017 that the youth of today were seized of the need to learn from this? I mean, they were discovering it for the first time. What was the reaction to learning this?
I think they found it very exciting to read contemporary literature from their own home. I mean, Northern Ireland, again, it's very small. And it was exciting to them to read contemporary works set in places they recognized. I got the sense that most of them had read very little Northern Irish literature before, maybe a little Seamus Heaney, and that was about it. So it was revelatory for them in that way. And I think the ones who really engaged with the class found it very exciting.
Okay. I think we've probably got time for one more question from someone, if anyone's got a question. No, I think so. Marilyn, thank you so much. I mean, I think we managed to keep the Brexit day a bit really sort of short, didn't we? Because we could have spent the whole hour on there. I'd urge anyone who wants to know more about the history to have a look at those two links before earlier. So I just want to say thank you so much to Marilyn. Thank you to Georgie for organising the this event and the whole series. So all of the series is available, or most of the series is available on YouTube, and we hope to have the video recording this one up in the next few days as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.